The Summit Beyond the Clouds. George Mallory's Life and Everest Climb Historically Dramatized. Episode 1. I was born on the 18th of June, 1886, in the quiet parish of Mallory, Cheshire. My earliest memory is of a small garden with a tall oak tree, its branches stretching in gentle arcs across the sky. There was a bench beneath that tree, and my father would often sit me there, speaking softly about the world, about how grand it could be, how every little wonder we glimpsed was only a smaller reflection of a vast and incomprehensible creation. At the time, my imagination seldom soared beyond the borders of that garden, let alone to the far corners of the globe. But perhaps the seeds of my later wanderlust were sown in those humble moments, where I learned to see small wonders and let them awaken my own sense of the boundless. My family lived a comfortable life in Mobberley, though not one of extraordinary privilege. My father, a clergyman, possessed a gentle soul. My mother nurtured a household that was mindful of decorum, but she always encouraged curiosity. There were rules, yes, but also an unspoken permission to explore. I remember wandering around the house, rummaging through dusty crates of books and old letters, discovering poems and diaries from long-gone relatives. My mother never scolded me for it. Instead, she'd say, "George, if you want to find something new, keep on searching." And that was the end of it. That spirit was the earliest impetus for me, a tacit vow that I'd never cease searching for something beyond the horizon. I had two sisters, Mary and Annie, and one brother, Trafford, but being the second child and the oldest son gave me a particular sense of responsibility. In those days, tradition dictated certain roles, and from my earliest days there was a notion that I should conduct myself with ambition, or, at the very least, with an eye toward respectability. But I was a dreamer, with the kind of mind that often drifted from the mundane tasks of boyhood to the images in the storybooks I loved to read. I was tall and lanky, not yet with the physical prowess that would later come to define me. I was simply a quiet boy, apt to daydream, my fingers turning pages of whichever volume I could get my hands on. Yet something changed when I was 7 or 8. My father, ever the dutiful parish rector, took me on small hikes, though we didn't call them that at the time. They were merely long walks or rambles over the rolling green fields of Cheshire. Each outing, I found myself walking a bit further ahead. I was enthralled by the idea that I could crest a small hill and see a new panorama that was hidden only a moment before. It thrilled me to realize that each step might reveal something entirely unexpected. I would stand on a rise, hands at my sides, letting the wind whip my hair, gazing about as though I'd encountered some majestic new world. In a sense, I had. At school, I performed well enough, though it was primarily because I was curious. I liked knowledge for its own sake, particularly geography and history. In geometry or Latin grammar, I was less enthusiastic, but I didn't shirk my duties. In time, my efforts took me to Winchester College, one of the more esteemed institutions, where I encountered the rigors of academic life in earnest. I recall entering those gates with a lump in my throat, overshadowed by centuries of tradition. The ancient stone walls, the hush of the corridors, and the solemn hush of the chapel seemed both intimidating and exhilarating. Winchester demanded discipline, but it also provided its students with certain liberties. One could join clubs, meet interesting people, indulge certain personal pursuits if one had the proper diligence to balance academic obligations. It was here that I truly discovered climbing. To be more precise, it was less mountaineering and more a practice of scaling local crags or venturing on strenuous cross-country walks during weekends or holidays. Still, it awakened something deep within me. I found I had a knack for physical endurance and a head for heights. Up on the rock faces, no matter how small or relatively unimpressive, I always felt a rush of exultation, as though the entire world of books, words, and constraints were left far below. Above me loomed only sky, and below a vantage of the valleys and trees that had seemed so imposing at ground level. In those moments, I sensed a calling. There was more to life than dusty volumes or the narrow corridors of an academic career. My time at Winchester gave way to Cambridge, Magdalen College, where I read history. Cambridge was a place of infinite possibility, or so it seemed to my young mind. I fell in with an intellectual crowd that debated art, literature, and politics deep into the night. Some nights we drank too much tea. Other nights we indulged in more potent beverages as we locked horns over abstract theories. Yet for me, the greatest thrill came from the climbing outings organized by some enthusiasts in the university. We travelled, whenever we could, to the Lake District or Wales, searching out new challenges on rock faces that towered above rolling countryside. There was a group of us, each with his own reason for climbing. Mine was intangible. I couldn't articulate it fully, only that each upward move brought me a sense of clarity and purpose. The entire world, with its petty debates, its chaos, receded into the background as I placed hand over hand on the crags. My mind grew quiet in those moments. My heart quickened, my senses sharpened. I remember thinking, I was made for this. Throughout my university years, I honed my abilities. I discovered that I had an excellent sense of balance, and though I wasn't particularly muscular, my wiry build served me well. More than that, I possessed a certain boldness that sometimes worried my friends. I took calculated risks on rock faces, but occasionally my calculations were more daring than others would have accepted. People started to mutter that I was something of a natural, that I had an instinct for the vertical. My success in climbing overshadowed my academic ambitions, though in truth I completed my degree with respectable marks. No one could question my devotion, but my longing clearly lay elsewhere. Another momentous event of my Cambridge years was meeting Rupert Brooke, the charismatic poet, and mingling with that circle of free-spirited thinkers who orbited him. Ideas flowed freely in the rooms at Cambridge, swirling amid the faint haze of pipe smoke. Art, poetry, politics, the meaning of life, no topic was too vast or too fragile to be probed. These conversations only reinforced my inclination that life's greatest truths were discovered through experience rather than mere contemplation. I recall reciting lines of Tennyson or Wordsworth, imagining the lonely grandeur of the mountains those poets evoked, even though it was an abstraction for them. For me, it was real life, or so I increasingly believed. Upon finishing my studies, I felt some pressure to settle into a respectable profession. Though the clergy's path was open to me by heritage, I found I couldn't bring myself to follow directly in my father's footsteps. Instead, I chose to teach. I became a schoolmaster in a small private school where I imparted knowledge of history to eager boys. Perhaps ironically, it was in sharing the stories of past explorers, conquerors, and discoverers that I realized my own story was only just beginning. Mornings in the classroom were spent discussing the voyages of Columbus or the campaigns of Napoleon. Afternoons, whenever time permitted, saw me out in the open air, walking, running, and climbing local outcroppings. I was restless, always restless. I told my colleagues, sometimes half in jest, that I wasn't meant for the chalkboard. They laughed, but I suspect they believed me. I was known for leading my students on vigorous hikes, ignoring rain and mud, forging up steep slopes for the pure adventure of it. In 1914, another adventure found me. Her name was Ruth Turner. We crossed paths through mutual acquaintances, and it wasn't long before I found myself hopelessly enamored. Ruth came from a comfortable background, lively and intelligent, with a bright gaze that spoke of quick wit and fierce independence. She was unlike any woman I'd known. She didn't merely indulge me when I talked of mountains and the glory of scaling them. She asked questions, probing my motives, trying to unearth what truly drove me. I realized quickly that her curiosity was genuine. She wanted to understand why the notion of altitude, of remote peaks and crisp air, so captured my soul. I tried to explain, fumbling with words, for I'd never really explained it to anyone before. I recall telling her something along the lines of, "It's not that I want to defy gravity or test myself against God's creation. It's that I find something of God's creation in the act of climbing itself." She nodded, but said little. and I had the sense that she understood more deeply than I could guess. When the war broke out that summer, the world changed irrevocably. I was newly married. Ruth and I had wed in May 1914 in the flush of optimism that the world, for us, was just opening up. But then came that wave of patriotic fervor and an entire generation of young men marching off to a conflict the likes of which no one could fully comprehend. I enlisted in the Royal Garrison Artillery, thinking that my sense of duty compelled me. I was no great soldier. I was simply another man in uniform. Yet the discipline and grit I'd nurtured on the rock faces would come to serve me well in the trenches, though to speak of service is to trivialize the horror of war. Shells rained down, men died in mud, and the smell of cordite and decay hung in the air. There is nothing romantic about it. I remember nights in France, crouched in a dugout, thinking about the mountains back home, trying to recall the light of dawn on rocky ridges. I'd close my eyes and picture fresh, cold wind on my cheeks, the sound of pebbles clattering down slopes far below, the sensation of straining muscles in my forearms as I inched upward. That memory sustained me, as did the letters from Ruth. I wondered if the madness would ever end, if we would ever go back to any semblance of normalcy. Yet in the midst of chaos, I would occasionally catch glimpses of men's extraordinary courage, as well as quiet acts of kindness. And I vowed that should I survive, I would never take for granted the simple privilege of standing atop a peak beneath the sun. When the guns finally ceased in 1918, the relief was mingled with profound sorrow for all that was lost. I returned to Ruth thinner, more haunted. She received me with open arms, but her eyes searched mine for the man she had married. We tried to rebuild a life, piece by piece. I resumed teaching, though my heart was far from it. The war had validated the ephemeral nature of life. I was more determined than ever to pursue something meaningful, something that would make me feel alive again. Soon I heard murmurs of an ambitious plan to explore the highest mountain in the world, Mount Everest. The idea resonated in my chest like a drumbeat. The first British reconnaissance expedition to Everest was organized in 1921 with the aim of mapping approaches and assessing the feasibility of a summit attempt. The organization behind it was the Mount Everest Committee, an amalgamation of the Royal Geographical Society and the Alpine Club. At that time, few in Europe had even glimpsed Everest, and no Westerner had ever set foot on its slopes. The mystery of the mountain was almost mythic, and the idea of climbing it was rumored among mountaineers in hushed, reverent tones. I was invited to join the party as a climbing member, and it felt like destiny calling. Ruth, pregnant with our first child, was apprehensive, but she also knew me well enough to recognize that I could not refuse. She gave me her blessing with a trembling smile, reminding me to be careful, for we had a future to build. Setting out for the Himalayas was like stepping into a fable. Even the journey itself was long and arduous, involving weeks by ship and then lengthy travel across India, eventually winding our way into Tibet. My first sight of Everest was from the Rongbuk Valley. Through the crisp, thin air, there loomed a vision I could scarcely believe, a colossal pyramid of rock and ice that seemed to pierce the heavens. I stood speechless, breath catching in my throat. All my prior climbs, all the alpine peaks I'd scrambled upon, suddenly felt like gentle preludes to this monstrous challenge. It was no mere mountain. It was a realm unto itself, a fortress of unimaginable scale. Our reconnaissance expedition that year was both triumphant and sobering. We explored the northern approaches, mapping the East Rongbuk Glacier, the North Col, and the ridges that would be crucial for any summit attempt. We faced high winds and extreme cold, coming to grips with the reality of altitude sickness. My lungs felt as though they could never truly fill with air, and my head pounded. The local Tibetan porters, who would eventually be known more widely as Sherpas, became our indispensable allies in these endeavors. They carried loads far beyond what I thought humanly possible. Though we lacked a complete shared language, we communicated with gestures, smiles, and a shared understanding that the mountain commanded respect. I found their strength and stoicism humbling. Even so, we did not attempt the summit that year. It was simply to gather knowledge, But the mountain had ensnared me. Every night, as I lay shivering in a tent pitched on hard ice, I dreamed of the summit. I pictured a triumphant moment atop the world's highest ridge, looking down upon the roof of the planet. Something in Everest's grandeur made it impossible to forget, an allure that was not merely about being the first. It was about confronting a test of human will, about placing oneself in a space so hostile, so remote, that survival itself was a victory, let alone success in climbing. There was something almost spiritual in that pursuit. Upon returning home, I found my new daughter, Claire, healthy and bright-eyed. Holding her, feeling her little fingers curl around my thumb, I was overwhelmed by life's miracle. For a time, I was content to simply be a father and husband, savoring domestic joys. But I would occasionally find myself turning to the maps we had drafted, tracing with my finger the ridges, camps, and passes of Everest. When I closed my eyes at night, the vision of that mighty peak would return. Ruth sensed it too, and though we rarely spoke of it, she must have known that my heart still yearned for those high places. It wasn't long before another expedition was announced, set for 1922, this time with the intention of making a genuine attempt on the summit. I joined again, eager and prepared to push myself further. During that second expedition, we made history by climbing above 8,000 meters for the first time, an altitude the human body is not naturally designed to survive. We had limited oxygen apparatus, a technology still in its infancy. Some of my fellow climbers thought using supplemental oxygen unsporting or unnatural. I considered it a tool, much like crampons or an ice axe. If it increased our safety and chances of success, it was worth it. Yet the 1922 expedition ended in tragedy. An avalanche on the North Col swept away 7 of our porters. I witnessed the horror from a vantage point where I could do nothing. The wind roared, the snow rushed down like a white demon, and in seconds those brave souls were gone. I recall standing there, numb, as my mind tried to comprehend the scale of the catastrophe. We tried to dig and search, but the mountain had already claimed them. There is no deeper sorrow in climbing than losing friends, or, in this case, the kind, stalwart men who had placed their faith in us. The incident cast a pall over our entire party. For all we had achieved, reaching unprecedented heights, a single avalanche could sweep away every triumphant notion. Everest demanded a price. Returning from that expedition, I faced a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. The press hailed us as heroes for climbing higher than any men before, but I could only think of the families of those porters. I recalled the softness of their voices, their footprints on the snow, how we had joked about the biting cold. I was torn between guilt and the knowledge that climbing was an inherently dangerous pursuit. Ruth tried to comfort me, reminding me that there had always been risks, and those men, like all of us, understood something of that. Yet the voice in my head persisted. You led them to that place. Still, even with that heavy burden, my desire to return to Everest did not wane. If anything, it grew more urgent. I wondered if finishing the quest, reaching the summit, would somehow give meaning to the sacrifices made. In 1923, we had another child, Berridge, our son. Parenthood was another dimension of life that made the idea of risking my existence seem selfish. Ruth never said as much, but I could see it in the worried lines on her face. Still, when news came that a 1924 expedition was being organized, I agreed without hesitation. It felt as though the future of British mountaineering and my own destiny hung on Everest. I told Ruth that I would climb the mountain and return safely, that I would not court unnecessary dangers. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and I promised. Yet in my heart, I knew Everest was never a place of guarantees. Episode 2. The 1924 British Mount Everest expedition was a grand undertaking by the standards of the day, indeed by any standard. We had an eclectic team of climbers, scientists, and porters, each man with his own strengths, weaknesses, and motivations. I had grown to admire Howard Somervell for his gentle demeanor and unflappable spirit. There was also Edward Norton, who had proven his capability on the previous expedition. And then there was Andrew "Sandy" Irvine, An engineer by training, significantly younger than me, with a remarkable aptitude for mechanics, it was he who took on the responsibility of improving our oxygen sets. Irvine was a curious choice for a summit partner, some thought, because of his relative inexperience at high altitude, but he was physically robust, and his mechanical skills were invaluable. Besides, I saw a bit of my younger self in him, his enthusiasm, his hunger for adventure. He was quiet at first, but there was a twinkle of determination in his eyes that told me he would not falter easily. We traveled to Tibet once again, crossing the same paths that were becoming strangely familiar to me. The dusty roads, the stone villages, the gentle ring of yak bells, and the swirling prayer flags near remote monasteries. For all its harshness, I had come to love Tibet, or at least the corners of it we traversed. There was a purifying simplicity in the high, barren lands. Life there was stripped to essentials: the cold, the wind, the sun, the daily quest for warmth and nourishment. Each day, Everest loomed closer, an immense white face dominating the horizon. She was as beautiful and intimidating as ever. Base camp was established once more along the Rongbuk Glacier. Tents sprouted like colorful mushrooms on the barren ground. We had improved gear since 1922, though by modern standards, it was all still quite primitive. Tents of heavy canvas, woolen layers, hobnailed boots. Our oxygen cylinders were large and unwieldy, but Irvine had tinkered with them, making them lighter and more reliable. All the same, the lines of worry on the older climbers' faces betrayed their caution. We knew how dangerous the route was. The North Col avalanche of 2022 was a fresh memory. We carried that tragedy like a shadow behind us. We established a series of camps up the mountain, ferrying loads with the help of our Tibetan porters. Each camp was a laborious step forward, perched on precarious ice shelves or rocky outcroppings. The altitude gnawed at our strength. Simple tasks, like brewing tea or lacing boots, became monumental. Sleep was elusive, rationed by our bodies' desperate attempts to adapt. We took to chewing cocoa leaves or sipping scalding liquids just to keep ourselves alert. Temperatures could plummet shockingly at night, so cold that my breath sometimes froze in my mustache. Despite the hardship, there were transcendent moments. I remember one dawn, stepping out of my tent at Camp 3, the horizon just starting to blush pink. The entire valley below was bathed in a soft lavender light. I saw ice crystals gleaming like jewels on boulders. Far above me, the dark summit ridges of Everest caught the earliest rays of sun. For a moment, I forgot the dangers and felt only awe. Felt that perhaps we climbers were engaged in something almost sacred. I closed my eyes and inhaled, tasting the icy air, feeling my heart's steady pulse. I thought, this is why I'm here. As the team pushed higher, establishing Camp 4 and then Camp 5 near the North Col, we faced the usual setbacks: savage winds, equipment failures, men succumbing to altitude sickness. My old friend Norton led a remarkable climb without oxygen at one point, reaching over 28,000 feet, an astonishing feat. But he came back frostbitten and exhausted, cautioning that the final ridge was a ruthless place, scoured by winds so fierce that standing upright became a challenge. In early June, the weather offered us a small window of relative calm. No storms expected for a day or two at least. That was all we could hope for in the Himalayas. We resolved to launch a final summit attempt. I felt physically worn down, but mentally I was keen. Sandy Irvine, for his part, was eager in his quiet, steadfast way. We looked at one another, a silent agreement passing between us. This was our moment, the culmination of all those years of dreaming and planning and heartbreak. We readied our oxygen apparatus, dividing the cylinders and checking the regulators. Irvine's mechanical knowledge was crucial here, ensuring that we wouldn't be stranded at a lethal altitude without oxygen. The night before we left, I couldn't sleep more than an hour. I lay in the tent, listening to the wind rattling the canvas, my breath shallow in the thin air. The thought of Ruth and my children flickered in my mind. I tried to picture their faces. For the first time, I had a moment of real dread. What if I did not return? The notion sat with me like a stone on my chest. I knew I had made promises, but I also knew how close we were to success. In the quiet darkness, I resolved that come what may, we would strive for the top with all the skill and determination we possessed. On the morning of June 8th, 1924, we rose early, harnessed ourselves to our packs, and left the higher camp, Camp 6, behind. We carried our oxygen cylinders, some basic food supplies, cameras, and the necessary climbing gear. The cold was searing, every breath like swallowing shards of ice. My lips were cracked, my skin raw, but adrenaline coursed through me. I felt a sense of destiny, as though I was stepping onto a stage for which I had been rehearsing my entire life. The slope steepened quickly, forcing us to move slowly. Each step was an effort, a small victory over gravity and altitude. We used our ice axes to chip footholds, scanning the route for hidden crevasses. The wind teased us, sometimes a mere breeze, other times a gust that threatened to topple us. Irvine trudged behind me, methodical in his movements. Occasionally we exchanged a glance, a nod, no words necessary. We paused at intervals to rest, inhaling through the oxygen apparatus. The hiss of the cylinders was a strange lullaby amid the lonely expanse. I recall feeling grateful that Irvine had improved the sets. I could breathe a measure more comfortably than on previous attempts. As the hours passed, the sun rose higher, bathing the ridge in harsh light. The glare off the snow was blinding. I was thankful for my goggles, but even they didn't fully block the reflective assault on my eyes. We pressed on, step by agonizing step, ascending a steep couloir. At one point, I glanced back and saw how far we'd come, the endless valleys dropping away beneath a shimmering veil of cloud. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. Everything below seemed minute, as though we were in another universe. Then we reached a crucial point near the base of what would later be called the first step, a rocky outcrop on the northeast ridge. Climbing it required precise footwork and a steady nerve, especially at that altitude. Irvine handled it without complaint, though I saw the tension in his jaw. We hauled ourselves up, resting on a small ledge. From there, the route curved around a ridge, leading to the second step, an even more formidable section of rock. Here, the air was so thin my head felt filled with cotton. My vision swam, and I had to steel myself against a wave of nausea. The last anyone saw of us, from below, was around that area. I do not know how our final steps were interpreted from that vantage, but I imagine we must have appeared small and fragile against the massive face of the mountain. From my perspective, we were forging a path that felt both new and inevitable. The slope of the second step was icy and steep, demanding every ounce of caution. We had rope between us, a lifeline in a place where a single misstep could be fatal. At times I hammered pitons into cracks in the rock, ensuring we had an anchor for safety. Still, each upward movement felt perilous. My mind waged an internal debate. Should we turn back? Is this madness? Yet my heart answered, just a bit further. Time blurred. I recall glancing at my watch, perhaps around 1 in the afternoon, though the exact hour is fuzzy in my memory. We edged along a narrow platform. The wind began to pick up again. Words came difficult. We saved our breath for the climb. Irvine gave me a determined look, and I nodded. Then we pressed forward. I found a small route around a protruding rock, planting my axe firmly. Snow crumbled beneath my feet. The mountain groaned as if alive. For an instant, I froze in place, feeling the rush of wind at my back, the infinite void beneath my boots. My mind screamed, "Don't look down!" But a surge of hope welled up within me too. We were so close. I could sense it. I imagined cresting the ridge, glimpsing the gentle arch of the summit only a short distance away. At some point, Irvine's oxygen apparatus jammed. He indicated the regulator, frustration etched on his frost-reddened face. We paused so he could adjust it, tinkering with the mechanism. The wind battered us, and we huddled together to preserve a fraction of warmth and shield the contraption. After a few tense minutes, he gave a thumbs up. The hiss resumed. We shared a faint grin. The summit was calling. We continued upward, following a faint groove in the rock. The slope grew steeper. My thighs ached. The altitude hammered at my senses. Each breath was a conscious, labored act. I kept my eyes on the next handhold or foothold, refusing to look at the drop beneath. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into an unmeasurable passage of time. I saw Irvine's boots behind me, felt the tug of the rope between us, our tenuous bond against the mountain's cruelty. Our final push was up a chimney-like crack, hidden partially by snow. With the oxygen set helping, I inched upward, hooking my axe over a small bulge. The wind howled. My foot slipped once, sending shards of ice skittering downward. I heard Irvine curse behind me. My heart thundered in my chest, but I regained purchase, forced my trembling legs to keep climbing. Then, at last, my hand found a solid grip. I pulled myself onto a narrow ledge. The highest point was almost within reach, perhaps a few 100 feet more. Irvine joined me, chest heaving. I recall that in that moment of near-complete exhaustion, we somehow found the strength to grin at each other. We were battered, battered by the savage cold, battered by fear, but also alive with something beyond mere adrenaline. I forced a few words between gasps. Not far now. Irvine nodded, lifting his head to squint at the ridge crest. This was it, a shot at immortality, or perhaps at some deeper communion with the spirit of climbing. In that rarefied air, I believed we were truly the closest men on earth to the heavens. What happened next is difficult to piece together, even in my own memory. Did we push on successfully over the second step? Did we crest the final snow slope? Some accounts later speculated that we might have reached the summit. Others claimed we were turned back by weather or technical obstacles. From within the swirl of history, I can only speak of what I felt. A sense of unstoppable momentum, a conviction that we would not retreat without a final attempt on the summit itself. Whether we arrived there is the eternal question. But I remember an abrupt shift, perhaps a gust so powerful that it rattled my nerves, or maybe I lost my footing. The rope tightened, and everything spun in a rush of disorientation. In that breathless altitude, events unfold like dreams. I saw the world tilt, felt my arms flailing. The hiss of oxygen, the roar of wind, a shout from Irvine. Perhaps he called my name. Snow and ice battered me. My eyes clenched shut against the sting. My heart pounded, and I gripped the rope, trying to anchor myself. But the mountain gave no mercy. It was as though we had trespassed too far, and she was shaking us from her slopes. I had a fleeting thought of Ruth, of her voice telling me to be careful. Then all was chaos. Episode 3. I felt weightless. Time ceased its usual flow, and I became acutely aware of the sound of my own heartbeat. There was a yank on the rope, but it offered no salvation. Gravity took hold, dragging us downward in a dreadful rush. The air whipped around, tearing at my clothes, freezing my skin. My mind screamed, yet there was no time for words. The endless slope of ice and rock blurred past. I do not know how long we fell, nor what illusions or glimpses flashed in the final, precious moments. A swirl of memory, my children's laughter, the garden bench in Moberly, the hush of the college library, the avalanche of 2022, the vow I made to Ruth that I would return. All of it merged into a single kaleidoscopic blink, overshadowed by the roar of the wind. I tried to twist my body, to arrest the fall, but the velocity was relentless. Then, an impact. A searing shock in my limbs, a bright, piercing light behind my eyes. After that, darkness. Some say that perhaps I survived the initial fall for a brief time, perhaps enough to sense the final hush on the mountainside. If so, I recall it only as an echo, a faint awareness of cold and stillness. Everest, in the end, would not release me back to the world I had known. In that stillness, I thought of my father's voice, his gentle lessons on wonder in the garden. I thought of the rapt faces of my students as I told them of adventure. I thought of my dear Ruth and our children, whom I loved more than my own life, and I hoped they would someday understand that I climbed not out of disregard for them, but from an inner compulsion to see the world's roof, to measure myself against it, and to expand the very notion of what humanity might achieve. No one could have known precisely what happened in those last moments, neither the watchers below nor the newspapers that would later speculate. The mystery would linger for decades. Many would debate whether we reached the top, analyzing sightings through telescopes, rummaging through diaries and letters, seeking some proof of a camera that might have recorded the summit. Some, I suspect, would romanticize our disappearance, weaving stories that turned us into legends. But as for me, in that fleeting juncture between life and death, my concerns were far simpler. I wanted to hold Ruth, to cradle my children, to reassure them of my love. Yet the mountains demand a toll, and sometimes they choose to keep those who venture too far into their domain. In the enveloping cold, my final reflection was that perhaps there is a nobility in striving for the unattainable, in pushing one's body and spirit to the edge to glimpse something grander than the confines of an ordinary life. Everest was my passion, my obsession, and my downfall. But if I had known all along what awaited me, I suspect I still would have made the same choice. For how else could I live, except in pursuit of that luminous horizon, always beckoning beyond the next ridge? So here my story ends, at least in the mortal telling of it. Those who remain behind will continue on. My children will grow. My wife will mourn, yet also pass on the stories of their father, who once stood on the slopes of the highest mountain, convinced he could conquer it. They will know that I loved them more fiercely than any summit. They will know that I tried, to the very last breath, to return home. I can only hope they also know that in reaching for the top of the world, I was reaching for something transcendent, a dream that propelled me across continents and up the loftiest heights of the earth. Everest stood unchanged after that day, indifferent to my fate. The snows and ice concealed my remains for 75 years until another expedition discovered my body, battered by time and yet preserved in the cold. By then, I was a distant, half-mythic figure in mountaineering lore. But in my own reality, I was only George Mallory, a husband, a father, a climber, who went up to the roof of the world to see what lay there, and who paid a dear price in the end. For some, that price may seem too high. For others, it may be the inevitable cost of seeking the edges of human possibility. I cannot tell them they are wrong. I can only affirm that the summit shone like a beacon in my mind, calling me onward, promising a glimpse of ultimate wonder if I could but endure. That promise, that call, is what carried me upward, step by step, until the mountain decided otherwise. Still, in some unspoken sense, I remain there, high on the cold slopes, forever a climber reaching upward through swirling clouds on the threshold of the dream that consumed me. And in that timeless place, perhaps there is a kind of peace, a quiet vantage where the world below is small and the vast sky above is endless, and the boundary between them is but a whisper of wind. The end,